Good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's my pleasure to moderate and the last session of this conference and introduce our last three speakers who were all MA students at CILE. I think this is a very good initiative to give students floor to engage in discussion with professionals in the field. Our first speaker will be Bilal Abdul Sathar. Bilal is a researcher focusing on the intersection of ethics and Sufism. Beside his MA in Islamic Applied Ethics, he had an MA in Islamic Jurisprudence from International Islamic University of Malaysia. He received he has two bachelor degrees, one in Islamic Jurisprudence from Al-Jamia Al-Islamiyya and another bachelor degree in economics from University of Calcutta. His other research interests include Islamic theology, philosophy, Sharia, Usul al-Fiqh, and economics. Bilal's presentation will be about Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq Allāh and virtue ethics, introducing the Sufi concept in modern discourse. Bilal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Yesterday, Professor Sophia and Professor Samir had touched upon the concept of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq Allāh, and now I would like to engage it from slightly different perspective, and that is to try to introduce the concept of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq Allāh in the modern discourse on virtue ethics. Currently, among the three dominant approaches within the normative ethics and deontology are deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. While deontology and consequentialism are action-centered and engage with the question, what kind of action should one perform? Virtue ethics is agent-centered and thus engages with the question, what kind of person should one be? Even though virtue as a notion played a dominant role while discussing ethical theories until the Enlightenment period, with the introduction of deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics, the attention shifted from the agent to action, pushing the role of virtue in ethical discussion to the backseat. Philosophers engaging in ethical discussion started focusing on the rightness, wrongness of a particular action more than the character traits themselves, which led to those actions. The interest in virtue was revived with the famous article by Elizabeth Ann Scobie in the 1950s, which expressed dissatisfaction in the prevalent moral theories like deontology and utilitarianism. Later scholars like Bernard Williams, Mcintyre, and others joined the line in bringing back virtue ethics to the center stage, stressing its importance and expressing their dissatisfaction with limitations present in the dominant ethical theories present at that time. Slowly, the growing interest in virtue ethics is noticed when fields outside philosophy like education, cognitive science, and medical ethics too started engaging with it. In spite of this, the secularization process has succeeded to a large extent, as it did in many other fields, either to keep it isolated from engaging with religious and spiritual dimensions, or to secularize virtues present in the religious discourse. However, a quick perusal of rich tradition of different religions shows that they too have contributions to make to the ongoing discussion on virtue ethics. Sufism, a practice in Islam which focuses more on spiritual development and acquisition of good character traits, has also got to contribute in this regard. Abul Qasim al-Junayd defines Sufism as the acquisition of virtues and erasure of vices. Also, one of the repeated ideas within the Sufi literature is the idea of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq Allāh, which means to assume the character traits of Allah. Sufis believe that the divine names and attributes are in fact virtues which each individual must try to emulate. And with the assumption of those virtues, human beings realize their full potential. Al-Ghazali mentions in his magnum opus, Ihya Ulumuddin, that the praiseworthy is everything that can be attributed to Allah, and those that cannot be attributed to Him is not perfection in itself. For Sufis, the meaning of being a perfect human lies in attaining the perfection of the divine names and attributes, where one learns and strives in realizing particular perfection associated with each divine name. Sufis believe that the divine names and attributes are in fact virtues which each individual must try to emulate, and with the assumption of those virtues, human beings realize their full potential. Moving on to the modern discussion on virtue ethics, Mcintyre explains virtue to be an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such goods. Understanding the importance of virtues, he mentions how enjoining them helps in the realization of full potential and true nature of human being. Here then, despite the secular framework in which the centrality of virtue was revived, one notices the similarity between the Sufi approach and modern approach on the emphasis given to the agent's acquisition of various virtues and how they lead to the realization of his full potential and true nature. However,
sorry, Bilal, can you please slow down a little bit? Because the translators cannot follow up.
All right, no problem. However, while in Sufi approach, as mentioned by Al-Ghazali earlier, the sources of those virtues are in divine names. In the modern approach as viewed by Mcintyre, the virtues should be understood using practical reasoning. Recognizing the similarities and differences in both the approaches, this research aims to examine both the approaches, strives to compare and create conversation between them, and finally tries to seek for potential contribution that could be made to the ongoing modern discussion on virtue ethics. In order to restrict the scope, this research examines the work of famous Sufi theologian and jurist Abu Hamid al-Ghazali to understand the concept of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq and analyzes the works of contemporary modern philosopher Mcintyre in order to situate the concept. Now, overall analysis of the literature found on Al-Ghazali and Mcintyre shows that it appears that despite virtue being central to their project, it is found that a comparative study between both the figures is absent. Also, Al-Ghazali's notion of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq, which primarily focuses on the virtues associated with each divine names and attributes, is missing while discussing his ethical theories. By trying to have a comparative study between these two prominent figures, this research introduces Al-Ghazali's isolated and neglected, yet very important notion pertinent to his ethics to the modern discourse on virtue ethics through Mcintyre's notion of tradition. This, to best of my knowledge, is not undertaken so far. Now, what is meant by Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq? Ibn Manzur in his work Lisan al-Arab explains the word takhallaqa to mean to take upon oneself in manifesting in his character, contrary to what it contains, similar to the word tajammala, where it manifests the beautiful. Now, to assume certain character means to assume that character which was not present earlier. Then the concept Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq here means to assume the character traits of Allah. The central understanding of the concept Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq is that each one of the divine names contain a certain virtue. For example, understanding beneficence from the divine name, the beneficent, and humans are required to acquire those virtues underlying in each divine names to their ability. The notion Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq was prevalent among early Sufis. Qushayri considers Abul Hussein Ahmad bin Muhammad al-Nuri, who died in 295 Hijri, to be the earliest expounder of the notion, who described tasawwuf to be Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq. From then on, succeeding scholars discussed this notion and differed in the understanding of this notion and also based this notion upon different foundation. Now, what was Ghazali's understanding of the notion? For Al-Ghazali, the way to achieve perfect happiness and realize full human potential begins with the reflection of the reality of the divine. He considers him as the only perfect existent whose virtues associated with each divine names and attributes must be assumed by humans. In Al-Ghazali's view, the desirability of this notion is dependent upon a saying that is attributed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, assume the character traits of Allah, along with another prophetic saying, given that God is characterized by the 99 names, whoever is characterized by one of them enters paradise. This together functions as the evidence and justification for him to present this notion of assuming divine character traits. Now, moving on to the contemplation of divine names is a four-stage process in Al-Ghazali's point of view. as the first stage referring to different teachings present in Quran and prophetic tradition. A servant speaks and remembers the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the second stage, which are the lessons, he then reflects and ponders on virtues implied by each divine name. In the third stage, as implication, this sets divine attributes as models which are to be followed by humans. And lastly, by understanding the counsels associated with each divine attribute, servants try to emulate them. Now, what is the relation between Al-Takhalluq and virtue ethics? David Solomon put forth three fundamental aims that virtue ethics strive for: to develop and defend some conception of the ideal person, to develop and defend some list of virtues that are necessary for being a person of that type, to defend view of how person can come to process the appropriate virtues. Now here one notices that the virtue ethics is understood to be normative theory that examines and explores the moral claims pertinent to the agent, more specifically regarding the character of the agent. The fundamental objective of this theory is to present an ideal human character with certain list of virtues. This follows with an ethical requirement for humans to possess and acquire those virtues if they were to realize their full human potential and happiness. The aim here then is in becoming a person of certain kind, where she changes his character as it was to as it should be. Now, reflecting Al-Takhalluq as is introduced by Al-Ghazali in the light of these three goals as is presented by Solomon regarding virtue ethics offers us new insights to ponder upon. Here we can observe that the ideal entity that Al-Ghazali proposes is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he proposes to emulate and acquire virtues associated with each divine name so that humans can realize their full potential. And finally, in his view, this could be attained by the four-step model mentioned earlier. Now, understanding the concept put forth by Al-Ghazali, we realize that its aim is akin to the goals proposed by the proponents of virtue ethics, opening the door and facilitating to introduce the concept of Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq in the modern discourse on virtue ethics. Now, what was Mcintyre's notion of virtue and his unique system of virtue ethics? Examining Mcintyre's system of virtue ethics, it is obvious that the contemporary world, with its new sets of problems, cannot merely repeat what was present earlier. Understanding this, Mcintyre introduces new conceptual framework through which virtues have to be understood. The three concepts are narrative unity of life, practice, and traditions. Overall, Mcintyre's project considers whole lives and whole people being significant to ethics, by not limiting itself to few actions or choices governed by obligation or categorized as being under the spectrum of morality. This understanding is more appropriate in realizing human flourishing, which is not limited to merely in the observance of right and wrong. Rather, it incorporates all aspects of life which shapes one's character. Flourishing requires one to develop his virtues and also to continue developing it as a lifelong project, as it is not possible to discuss the good life by breaking it into bits and pieces of unrelated acts. Now, how can modern discourse on virtue ethics give space for Sufism to play a role through the concept of tradition? Mcintyre thinks that history provides us with a better knowledge in understanding a particular tradition and the virtues developed in that tradition. Mcintyre observes that an agent's narrative identity should be located within more pervasive and larger societal narratives, where the notion of tradition provides essential historical context in understanding the individual lives and practice. Tradition is also the medium through which these practices are formed and passed on throughout the generation. In this sense, tradition becomes very crucial to us, and Mcintyre demands that one must be acquainted with the tradition he belongs or that he confronts with. The reason to be acquainted.
Sorry, Bilal,
Sure.
a little bit slower.
Yeah.
We will give you a
No
couple of
problem,
minutes,
no
okay? Don't worry about the
Okay,
time.
no problem. All right.
A little
Okay.
rahmah
In
for
this
the
sense,
translation.
No problem. In this sense, the tradition becomes very crucial to us. And Mcintyre demands that one must be acquainted with the tradition one belongs. The reason to be acquainted with one's tradition is because it is the tradition that enlightens us with knowledge and also in better understanding the idea of good life that is befitting for humans. However, the contemporary self discards tradition and rather bases upon laws. This concept of tradition in Mcintyre's system of virtue ethics, which tries to retain the laws, culture, and tradition, recognizes and accommodates comparison between traditions by being critical and also helps an agent in better understanding of himself. Now, this happens in the larger context along with the notion of good life and well being, and this opens the door for having critical engagement with different tradition. Now, it is through this concept of Mcintyre's tradition that this research introduces the notion of Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq present in the Sufi tradition to the modern discourse. Now, as mentioned in the introduction, Sufis also have been busy with the same concerns of what virtue ethicists are busy with in the modern times, like the centrality of virtues and cultivating them, the notion of well-being and good life, and finally realizing full potential and perfection. Now, one of the key Sufi ideas that directly engages with these concerns is the idea of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq. Al-Ghazali develops and defends the notion that the well-being and perfection, which happens to be the most sought-after phenomena in modern times, lies in the divine names and attribute alone. And thus, the meaning of being perfect human lies in attaining perfection of divine names and attributes, where one learns and strives in realizing particular virtues associated with each divine name. Al-Ghazali mentions how knowledge of self in its entirety and not just in mere piecemeal is essential in attaining knowledge about Allah. In his view, the perfect happiness, that is as-sa'ada al-haqiqiyya, which should be ultimate end for humans, is found in the hereafter, as-sa'ada al-ukhrawiyya, where humans become God's intimate and also enjoy in the paradise of God's vision. Because humans are created in God's image, they have a unique part to play in creation and special capacity in emulating Allah's creative activity. This actually facilitates them in knowing and loving God more, which helps them to emulate the divine character traits. Advancing closer in likeness to the divine allows humans to experience even greater intimacy with Him, eventually realizing their fulfillment of a sa'ada ukhrawiyya. Here one has to note that the returning to God is on two levels. One, by cultivating the divine image present in humans, by emulating the divine character traits, and the second is actually returning to Him in the hereafter by having the vision of God and being with Him the hereafter. Now, when analyzing the teleological nature of virtue ethics, with its decision in opposing modern ethical theories, stressed the distinction between deontology and teleology. Mcintyre links his project tightly with the concept of well-being by discarding deontic concepts completely, like obligatoriness, righteousness, and wrongness. He also thinks that virtue ethics must not be founded on any other significant principle apart from the virtues, which must be teleological scheme, or else the very foundation of virtue ethics withers, resulting in the failure of resisting the modern ethical theories. Al-Ghazali, throughout his writings, focuses on what, in his view, is considered to be Islam's teleological dimension, which is to return to God, and thus, accordingly, integrates all aspects relating to faith and practice of a Muslim to it. In his view, whoever pursues in this journey learns the instructions present in the Quran, prophetic tradition, and sayings of his companions in order to guide them in their practice. Here, the seeker responds to the instructions present in them and fulfills the required responsibilities related to worship and social duties, considering them as means to gain proximity with Allah by becoming His intimates. Even though Al-Ghazali's notion of a takhalluq resembles virtue ethics in its teleological scheme, at the same time, it also accepts and accommodates deontic characteristics as understood from above. Peart and Patterson mentions few scholars who create distinction between the strong thesis of virtue ethics with the weak thesis of the same in order to solve this complication. While the former rejects deontology, the latter accommodates it. In this sense, Al-Ghazali's notion of a takhalluq can be considered as weak thesis of virtue ethics, yet still belonging to virtue ethics. However, Mcintyre's model of virtue ethics presupposes two characteristics. First one is that he clearly draws a distinction between deontology and teleology. The second one is that he considers both of them to be antagonistic. Here then we understand that he does not approve of the mixing between the two, and thus the weak thesis of virtue ethics is not acceptable in his view. Nonetheless, one cannot deny the fact that Al-Ghazali's notion of a takhalluq contains some aspects of teleological scheme present in virtue ethics, but also recognizes the deontic scheme within its whole framework, thus not treating both deontology and teleology as an antagonistic problem. For Al-Ghazali, both agents' quality and rules are important and also rely on one another without one excluding the other. For him, the source of both are from the divine. Here then, the difference among Al-Ghazali and Mcintyre lies in the degree of acceptance of the rules in their framework. Now, what is the potential contribution that Sufism can achieve within virtue ethics? There are 5 potential contributions which I think this research offers. Contrary to the secularized discourse on virtue ethics, where God is removed from the center and the man is being introduced as the ultimate Lord making decisions for themselves, this approach reinstates the centrality of God in the discourse. Also, in the age where modern atomic self is cut off from his tradition, Mcintyre's approach tries to link the individual to his tradition, as he observes that it is with the linking one has better understanding of the individual life, practices, and the idea of good life that is befitting the humans. By presenting the notion of Al-Ghazali through this concept of tradition, modern Muslims are provided with an understanding of how their lives could be linked to the tradition as well. Now, unlike the worldly telos which are aimed at by the modern virtue ethicists that are observed to be limited and insufficient from Islamic worldview, Al-Ghazali's framework provides more comprehensive telo of Sa'ada Ukhrawiyya, which directs and guides all human behavior and actions, rather than the extreme position which Mcintyre adopts regarding the distinction between deontology and teleology, and also by considering them to be antagonistic. This approach blends both virtues and rules to the larger end of Sa'ada Ukhrawiyya. Finally, by emulating the divine character traits, one gains proximity with the divine before they gain proximity with them in the hereafter. Here then, God is considered to be ever present in each and every behavior and actions of an individual. Now, as a concludatory remarks, even if Mcintyre questioned the prevalent ethical theories and tried to propose a more comprehensive framework by offering narrative unity of human life and understanding this in a larger tradition, it still cannot accommodate a Muslim whose worldview also includes Allah and a life hereafter. Not only that, the extreme position he holds against the deontology, focusing on teleology, makes it troubling for Muslims to accept the idea, as adopting his understanding of virtue ethics means to do away with the instructions, responsibilities, and duties present in the divine revelation as well. What is unique in Al-Ghazali's approach is that he strikes a balance where both the virtues and rules are in fact reflecting the telos, which is to attain a sa'ada ukhrawiyya. Even though his notion of a takhalluq bi-Akhlāq focuses on virtue and the agent by seeking virtues associated with each divine names and attributes and then presenting four-step model in order to emulate them, he does not in his larger framework ignore the obligations and responsibility present in the divine revelation. It is this aspect which maintains God at the center, includes hereafter in the worldview, and strikes a balance between rules and virtues, reflecting the greater telos of a sa'ada ukhrawiyya that is absent in the modern discourse on ethical theories, be it deontology, teleology, and even virtue ethics. And this troubles a Muslim in modern times while engaging with those theories. Now, finally, my attempt in this research was not to claim how Islamic virtue ethics is better and comprehensive than secular virtue ethics. Rather, the attempt was to engage Islamic notions with the contemporary discourse on virtue ethics so that Muslims, instead of feeling distant and having to discard their God and tradition, can in fact start engaging from the vantage point of their religion, tradition, and identity. I believe that the attempt to introduce Al-Ghazali's notion of Al-Takhalluq bi-Akhlāq in the modern discourse on virtue ethics can be considered as a humble beginning towards this end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Bilal, for this stimulating lecture, really. I think it will raise a lot of questions and debates.